So it's good to see so many people still here. This is our final panel, and hopefully we'll round off, and no pressure, but this team will bring it home. No pressure, right? And I'm going to be looking for, because the minister is gone, I'm going to pick on one of these three. They think I'm going to pick this seat here next to me, but I'm going to kind of mix it up a little bit. So I'm actually going to look for a brand owner or a CEO from a food company to come and sit here and have one of these three gentlemen make the final pitch for about 30 seconds. So just to prepare on both sides, right? Okay, let me start with Jim. Jim, that is a daunting project, the City project, Consumer Information Transparency Initiative. How many companies will actually participate in the next phase, this Gen 1 to Gen 2?
Yeah, we're out right now building a forecast for companies that are going to participate, and we're going to get complete visibility to that. So for a company to participate, they by the trademark agreement, so we can actually get the quantitative data. It looks like we're going to have about 10,000 items in the marketplace by December. I can tell you there are 12 today that are actually shipping with the QR code. About 10,000 items by December, moving to tens of thousands through 2016, and I think we'll cross about the 100,000 mark in mid-2017.
Right. Now on your slide you mentioned 90 companies and probably a couple hundred people as well. That must have been like herding cats. How did you get them to consensus?
Yeah, by the time we were done, we had about 325 people with huge diverse background. I guess there's three pieces of learning that I would apply anytime we're dealing with a complex topic like this. Number one, spending time up front making sure people are focused on what does success look like. And the thing we talked about a lot, if I ask 5 people here what's the best way to get to the airport, I may get 5 different directions, and then we'd argue about whose way to get there is better. So we spent a lot of time saying what's our objective, and then we just chose a path instead of arguing about who's right. The second thing, we had a principle of an acceptable range of options. And we wanted to make sure that we built this thing with enough flexibility that each brand or business had a little bit of agility, but to the consumer, it's consistent. So a lot of the habits on these groups like this, 325 people, so what's the answer? And I think we said, no, we're going to come up with an acceptable range of solutions. And then the final thing, and I think it's really helped, the measure of success is in market execution. And we will get to that endpoint faster because we went slow a little bit to start. And we spent an awful lot of time building community and enrolling people in what we're going to do and how we're going to get it done, so that by the time the project was actually moving, you had everybody was aligned.
Right. That's great. I have more specific questions for that later. But Greg, you heard a lot of talk today about public-private partnerships. And you got some really interesting revelations, I think, in your report that's coming. Will your report recommend stronger public-private partnerships?
Yes, it will. I guess one of the advantages, New Zealand's about food. One of the advantages we have is, I think, our lack of size in that regard. So it actually makes it, I think, a lot easier to partner with government. The MPI, as we saw it, so industry relationships good, but very good actually, but you can always do better. We'd like to see sort of more staff secondments, simulation exercises being carried out, as I guess described by Air New Zealand, between the regulators, there's no surprises anywhere, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So yes, we see that being developed even further than it is today.
Fantastic. Alastair, in your role, are you seeing opportunities within New Zealand for closer cooperation and partnering?
Oh, absolutely. For a country of our relatively small size, I think there's tremendous opportunities. If you think of the food industry here, there's just under 4,000 food manufacturers, 1,700 registered exporters, and there's approximately 20 industry associations which support that. So, I mean, just within private industry alone, there's lots of opportunities, I think, for companies to come together and work together on food safety. And then if you add in the public sector, if you look at the 9 CRIs, 7 of those have a strong focus on the food industry and food safety. You've got 8 major universities. Interestingly enough, the universities had a meeting on the weekend together with NZTE and the Callaghan Institute, and there was a very strong message came out from that meeting of the university sector in New Zealand wanting to support business, particularly in the export field, in terms of providing a much stronger export base, and food safety is a key component of that. So I think both in the private sector and in the public sector, there are plenty of opportunities and organisations in New Zealand for companies to come together and partner with.
Right. And just on that point, going back to Greg, I'm not sure if you mentioned this in your briefing, maybe I missed it, but in your evaluation of what's going on the ground today, the as-is situation, did you also look outside of New Zealand? Did you look at systems in other countries and benchmark?
Yes, we did as far as we could with the capability we had. So no one got on a plane on behalf of the group. We did have a budget. But we did have a lot of capability within the group and a lot of experience in offshore markets and the like, as we also had out of MPI. There was nothing, unfortunately, we could just pick off the shelf and say that fitted and used. That would have been really great. But I guess as learnings, you saw some here from the Irish, so that was a key thing we looked at. But there was nothing, I guess all food systems are unique, and ours is particularly, well, I'm talking about dairy, particularly unique. So there was nothing we could pick off the shelf, but certainly we did have a look as well as we could. And obviously with the internet and that, you know, that's a lot easier to do.
Gotcha. Jim, operations guy at P&G, you have a lot of experience in traceability. What kind of guidance would you give the team based on what you saw and heard from Greg? Does anything pop out that from your experience at P&G that here's something that you really need to focus on?
Yeah, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is supply chains aren't local. Mm-hmm. And we do a lot of lip service to the utilization of standards, but we don't practically put that in operation. And a lot of times if there's an event or an issue, you've got to track it down, and then you've got to load that information. You know, even in the US, we worked on a product recall system in the US, and there's no supply chain in the US that doesn't also feed Canada, but we didn't have Canada and the US agree on the same set of standards. So, you know, driving that whole idea of seamless information flow is really important.
So on that point, you mentioned earlier GS1 standards and the GDSN system, the Global Data Synchronization Network. Was your thinking at the time in driving towards standards for the data attributes, was that really to ensure interoperability between the trading partners?
Yeah, that was really it. Today on all those attributes, not everybody uses the same definition, and you have to spend a lot of energy storing it in 12 different locations, and then you update it, and you got to remember all the different locations where it's stored. And so we quickly find out that our data accuracy is lousy, and we wonder why. So that became an underlying principle of this: is how do we, how do we leverage standards? And the good news about this is all the entities that are working on this project all see the value of seamless information flow. I'll tell you, they're not there yet, right? But they're all committed to saying, yes, we understand the value of that, and we've got to get there. And a lot of these are legacy system issues, which is why we keep saying, what's it going to take to get you there by 2017 so people can build it into their CapEx programs and move.
Right, gotcha. Greg, I loved your socks, by the way. I thought I was going to have really cool socks on today, but I want a pair of those socks. They're fantastic. What do you think, Catherine? They look good from down there? Sorry for picking on you for that. When you were going through the dairy work group, what was the sense in the room? You mentioned that there was some dynamics going on about nobody thought they had a better competitive advantage. What were the actual dynamics? What were you experiencing in that dialogue? Were people saying, look, brand New Zealand is number one and we're all number two? But surely there must have been someone in there that said, look, I have maybe not a best practice, but a good practice that I want to share.
Yes, there's a few dynamics that I found fascinating. We don't compete in the space very much came from the dairy company interviews more than from the group. So our group was sort of a mix of educators, regulator, dairy companies, sort of there was a mix. So it came very strongly from that sector. The other thing in dairy that was fascinating was, and I don't know how senior management would see it, but sort of at level 3 throughout the dairy companies, there was a fantastic network that operated around sharing practice. And of course, many had started life in the dairy board of the dairy companies pre-Frontier, so there was a knowledge amongst them, they knew each other well. Over time, as some of the smaller dairy companies get larger, Frontier gets smaller, that dynamic will change, which actually is a risk. Because the informal network is actually superb. And it's something that is very valuable. The other thing that came out for us, the old department of DRI, which Frontier Research Centre now bought post-merger, was a great go-to place for science. And that's something else that we're sort of struggling with around, you know, you can't absolutely replicate that, but dairy companies did have sort of a central repository they could go to get what they needed if they had a problem. They tend to try and do that informally now, which worked quite well, but it's something we've got to think through.
Gotcha. Alastair, in your role at AsureQuality, what are you seeing? How would you estimate let's say, the success of traceability in New Zealand? Do you see, are organizations generally competent, or are you seeing gaps in that area?
Look, I think it's still a developing field. It's an area that has really risen to the fore internationally over the last 5 or so years, and what we've seen is a lot of activity, not just here in New Zealand, but offshore as well. And so I think part of the challenge is finding solutions that are that work for all players in industry, that there are options. One size won't fit all, but equally, you know, industry doesn't want 100 solutions or 200 solutions. It becomes very complicated, particularly when you're exporting into different markets as well. So the challenge is to develop some common solutions that will fit, you know, all industry, and providing a selection from a few really workable solutions rather than many solutions. So we're heading in that direction. There's some great initiatives taking place. Without wanting to turn into a plug for AsureQuality, but we've just formed an alliance with a company that provides traceability and authentication, and we have our own product which provides verification of different companies' certification. So that's one solution, and for those of you who are here tomorrow, you'll see a little bit more about that. But as I said, it's an emerging field, and the field is moving very rapidly.
Gotcha. So building on that, Greg, your report, your recommendations will probably converge on a few options that industry can choose. What are the risks associated with making those recommendations and the successful implementation?
I think the greatest single risk is the heavy lifting that some parties have got to do, to be really blunt. In the case of us, that's probably MPI, it's Dairy NZ, it's Dairy Companies Association, and the advisory group that advises Maritime Food Safety. So there will be other parties, but it will be their commitment to do some heavy lifting in this space. I guess the subtle stickers, if you look at New Zealand's history on health and safety, you know, we came a long way through non-regulation, started in a different place. Food safety starts in a good place. Our health and safety started in an appalling place. But at the end of the day, it did take the big stick across governors to actually get the change in culture that's happened. You know, threatening governors with jail for fatalities certainly focused the mind. I hope we don't get there with this. I hope this one, we're not recommending regulation because we think the industry is in a position that doesn't need regulation today. It's not broken, but we're future looking, and future looking wise, there'll be capability needs. So it will be those parties to get them behind this. You know, we've talked about a lot today. Changing culture is easy to say, damn hard to deliver on. So it takes massive commitment to do it, tangible commitment.
Gotcha. I noticed, by the way, you're hiding your socks since I called them out there. So it's okay. Just let them feel relaxed.
I didn't manage a matching tie like you. I think it looked not too good, actually.
They're really good. Jim, over to you. So this stuff you're doing in the US, I mean, this is leading. There's no other country doing this. There's no other associations that are doing something as big. But are you restricted to the US? You know, could New Zealand feasibly take this initiative and drive the same type of initiative for consumer information transparency here? And if so, how should they approach it?
Yeah, in fact, I love Captain Morgan's statement here. Just take our manual and use it, right? So, So we are doing a lot of heavy lifting. As we started the project, we worked very closely with the Consumer Goods Forum, and the Consumer Goods Forum is made up of about, I don't know, a couple hundred, but the board is 25 manufacturer CEOs, 25 retailer CEOs. It's all the global outfits, and they have a strategy called end-to-end value chain. So we took this project to them and agreed, let's build this with globalization in mind. So we've had, actually on the US project, we've had the chief operating officer from Aon Japan actually take part in the calls every other week just to make sure we're not doing anything that goes off kilter. So I actually think we're building something very purposely to plug and play. The differences will be, or the similarities and differences, if you take a look at those 397 attributes, I'd be surprised if there was not every one of them in there is applicable here. Right, and if you took a look at the attributes, you could probably come up with 800 attributes or so. But if you prioritize, you'd probably get pretty close to these 350. Mm-hmm. The one thing that will be different in the U.S., we said the required attributes are those required by law, but that's the principle. So we've been working with some of the folks in Europe. EU 1169 is a different law, so the required attributes are those attributes necessary for EU 1169. So the numbers will be different, but I think it can play, even the plug and play pictures and things like that. And left to its own device, people will tweak. Right. Right. And everybody here is probably has sons or daughters or siblings that live outside of New Zealand. We were talking at dinner, you know, and consumers travel today. Right? Our kids are borderless, and when they find differences for no reason, that undermines trust. Mm-hmm. Right, it undermines the credibility of what we're doing. So I really think we've got the ability at the CGF board meeting in December. I'm making a plea to these the CGF, make the U.S. wildly successful, so that we can learn there and take it, and everybody can just plug it and run.
Any people from marketing here? Marketing? No, that's good. How do we keep the marketeers away from the data? Because there's an old joke many years ago, because there's no marketeers here, I can say it, and the acid test of your marketing department, how do you know if your marketing department is effective? And the answer to that is when the salespeople don't know they're lying. So they've actually drank the Kool-Aid and they can believe it. So I'm sorry, I apologize if anyone was in marketing or wants to get to marketing, but so how do we, you know, there's one of the academic definitions of transparency, and we know transparency is a key enabler of trust, but one of the academic definitions is where you can share information through the supply chain without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. Right. And that those marketeers tend to distort it a little bit.
So there's two things that I think we've really dealt with, and first comes around this idea of an acceptable range of options. So when you take a look at those pictures, there are a lot of brand owners that said, I don't want anything so generic and stable. I need to leverage my equity. So we've allowed companies to do that. The look and feel of the landing page is the same, but if you chose to have the consumer come in and the default tile is your branded page, you can do whatever you want in there. But the information then is still organized the same way. We've been really clear on required and voluntary attributes with definitions, but this is actually also a marketer's dream, right? So you've got a consumer. The consumer's on your website, right? So if it's your brand, the consumer's on your website. They're asking about information about your brand, and all of a sudden they get to a point where they want to know an attribute that industry hasn't defined. So all there is a visual cue that you're off the landing page, and now I'm now talking to the Hershey's Kisses brand about what I mean by fair trade sourcing of cocoa or whatever, but you're having a one-to-one dialogue with the very engaged consumers, and the marketers actually see the value in that.
Gotcha. Greg, you mentioned something that I thought was quite surprising in your report. You're going to come out and state that weak sector leadership on food safety and capability. Why? Why is that?
I guess, why is it? Got another question, I'll come back to me.
How does it manifest itself in some of the dialogue and questionnaires that you had, that you can come up with that conclusion?
I guess not a common theme would be what we saw, which leads you to believe that.
Right, right. Now, is there then a role for academia to jump in with more leadership development, leadership training?
Well, education, will respond to what the market pull. I think the market pull's not strong enough. I would actually start there.
Right.
And, that gets back to this thing of culture, highly valuing staff in this area. I think, it isn't seen as a career of choice today, so I'd rather start with sort of the market pull than the other way. I think that's going to be much more successful. So, one coordinated approach to it and valuing it, celebrating its success, something we don't do, those sorts of things. There will be examples out there of very successful innovations, both from people, individuals and companies, and celebrating some of those things. All the things that good industries, or not good, this is a good industry, but that all the things that are done to sort of develop a very strong culture.
Right. Alastair, are you seeing the same out in the industry?
Yes, we are, and I think just going back to the question of what's changed in the culture. I think historically, New Zealand has enjoyed high standards of food safety, food quality, and I think as the economy has put even more focus on the export sector, where the supply chains are much longer, I think that over time has exposed us to markets where perhaps there have been issues of food safety which we haven't been exposed to as much here in New Zealand. So I think historically perhaps there hasn't been as much need for it, or at least a perception there hasn't been the need for it, whereas now in a global economy we're much more focused on it, we're much more aware of it. So I think that's partly the reason why we see a need to raise the dialogue a lot more.
Jim, in your time at Procter & Gamble, leadership is a vital asset. It's critical to the success of your business. Now, you also managed down in the region here for 3 or 4 years, New Zealand and Australia. What are the tips or nuggets you would give based on your professional experience at Procter & Gamble as a global food company to some of the food companies here? And let's say you were talking to a CEO of a food company on how to develop leadership training, leadership development for food safety.
So it's been interesting to me listening to the dialogue today, and I think a lot of it does come back to leadership. A lot of things that we've talked about today, you'd love to have been able to predict that, right? So how do you predict criminal activity? And I don't think you can, but what you do need to do is make sure your organization is agile and responsive. Right, and I believe that's the role of leadership. In my career with P&G, I lived through the Rely recall, when all of a sudden information that was coming in that was damaging it, and people made quick decisions in days to withdraw the thing from the market and not go through hand-wringing about, the science is inaccurate. So I think that's the advice. I don't think that we can ever regulate, control criminal activity or unusual events that just can't come out of the blue. But leaders need to be agile and responsive in a hurry.
Gotcha. I have a final question for all three of the panelists, and it's related to what Greg mentioned with regard to reporting relationships. I thought it was fascinating that in some cases quality reports into the manufacturing leader. And that's not always the best way because of the conflicting KPIs. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more, or what is the remedy for that?
I guess it depends where, if you're going to develop an organisational culture around food safety, it's got to have sufficient visibility in our view to do that. So there's a couple of things going on. One, if you have food safety reporting in to a manufacturing manager, powder manager, whatever it might be, I think you've not given it that visibility. But two, I think culturally you're trying to mix oil and water. You've got one individual who's got a key requirement. It's high pressure stuff, dairy processing, particularly sometimes you get the product out the door, and you should then have another culture of more caution, I guess, and testing and all the like. So I think, and I guess to the Air New Zealand example, nothing is pure. So there are judgments made around food safety all the time. There isn't yes or no. And the examples we've seen where it has gone wrong publicly have been in that space of grey. Do we hold? Do we ship?
Attention please. While our test is not complete.
So, you can argue the hold is going to be more aligned with this food safety individual. The ship is probably going to be more a line with a manufacturing manager who's got a warehouse that's overflowing at a certain point in the year. So it's around those sorts of issues.
Yeah. Any comments on that, Alastair?
Yeah, I would. I think there's probably arguments on both sides in terms of where the reporting should lie. But one thing to me is absolutely clear, and that is that it starts at the top, and it has to be owned by the chief executive and the executive team. And I think once that ownership and that visibility of leadership is there, the reporting lines, there will be pros and cons for where they sit within the organisation, but the most important thing is how do the leaders in the organisation act and how do they behave around food safety.
Gotcha. Now the final question, Jim thought he was going to get away from this, but it's actually for Jim. Yeah, exactly. So Jim, you're with GMA, you got 300 of the food companies in the US, and your counterpart is over here, Catherine Rich. Now Catherine is a former government minister, we know that, but in this context now, you've done this, the Information Transparency Project in the US, and now you have a 30-second coaching session with Catherine. What do you want to tell Catherine about your project and how she could succeed in New Zealand in working with her industry members? You have 30 seconds.
So 30 seconds. This is all about continuing to earn consumer trust. I mean, if you cut through it, everything we do has to have the consumer in the middle. I think too often we get caught up into the science, or we get caught up into the public relations or the spin. And so I think the task of this is always keep the consumer at the forefront of why we do it. And if the consumer's at the forefront, you don't have the questions about what you do on product quality, you don't have the questions you do on transparency, and you build and sustain that trust.
Catherine, ready to go? Fantastic. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists here, and I'd like to thank all of you as well for being here. I'm going to pass over to John, if you can come up and take over. But for me personally, it was a great honour to be here and to facilitate the panel discussions today. I think everyone did fantastic, a lot of great information sharing. And don't forget, next Monday morning, you have to do something. And please take away the lessons learned from here. Those that are in academia, we do need to build in culture-sensitive training into our academia. We do need to think about how do we train people to think like a criminal. That is very important. So it's actually very exciting. I'm an ex-reserve police officer, and it's actually pretty good when you think like a criminal. You can actually solve some problems proactively. So think about that in your organization. Think about remotivating your teams, re-energizing them with some of the things you learned here. Hopefully you didn't get your pants scared off with the food fraud and the food defense issues. I think working as a team in New Zealand, you'll get to that next level. There's only one hope that I have, and that's that Ireland do beat the All Blacks in the final, and our rendition of River Dance will trump your haka. So John.